Rain had been falling on Ostara for 3 days straight, and Daniel Voss was beginning to think the planet had a personal grudge against him. His scout ship, a battered old surveyor-class vessel he had flown for 6 years, sputtered through the storm clouds with one engine coughing black smoke. He had been sent out here alone, as usual, to catalog mineral deposits on a world that human charts listed as uninhabited. The charts were wrong. He found that out the hard way when a burst of lightning fried his navigation system and sent him spiraling toward a cliffside he never saw coming. The crash was ugly. Metal screeched against rock, sparks flew across the cockpit, and Daniel was thrown hard against his restraints before everything went dark for a few seconds. When his eyes opened again, smoke filled the cabin and warning lights blinked uselessly around him. He unbuckled himself, coughing, and dragged his body out through a crack in the hull, falling onto wet grass just as the storm began to ease. His leg throbbed. Blood ran down his forehead. He had no idea where he was, only that the crash had knocked him far from where he intended to land. Through blurred vision, he saw shapes in the distance, tall and moving with purpose, gathered around something glowing faintly in a clearing beyond the trees. He told himself it was probably just his head injury playing tricks. Then he heard the chanting. It was not human. The voices were deep, layered, almost musical, rising and falling in a rhythm that felt ancient. Curiosity fought with pain, and curiosity won, as it often did with Daniel. He limped toward the sound, gripping a broken branch for support, pushing through wet ferns until the trees opened into a wide clearing bathed in soft blue light. What he saw stopped him cold. Enormous creatures stood in a circle, easily 3 times his height, covered in scales that shimmered like polished stone under the strange light. Their long necks curved gracefully, their eyes glowed faintly gold, and leathery wings folded against powerful bodies. Dragons. Real, living dragons, standing in solemn silence around a cluster of large eggs resting on a raised stone platform in the center of the clearing. Daniel's first instinct was to turn and run, but his injured leg buckled beneath him, and he stumbled forward with a loud crash into the clearing, breaking twigs and gasping in pain. Every head in the circle turned toward him at once. Golden eyes locked onto the intruder. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then the eggs began to crack. One by one, the shells split open, and small creatures emerged, wet and trembling, blinking against the light for the first time. This was the choosing, the most sacred ceremony among the Dralath, when newly hatched younglings would look upon the gathered elders and bond forever with the one who would guide and protect them. It had happened the same way for 10,000 years without fail. Every hatchling had always turned to an elder. Every single time. Not this time. The first hatchling wobbled on unsteady legs, turned its head toward the massive elders standing proud and still, and then turned away from them entirely. It fixed its wide eyes on Daniel instead, chirped loudly, and began stumbling straight toward him. A second hatchling followed, then a third. Within moments, all 12 hatchlings had abandoned the elders completely and were crawling, tumbling, and flapping their way toward the injured, bleeding stranger who had crashed into their sacred ceremony by accident. The elders stood frozen, their golden eyes wide with something between horror and disbelief. An old and dignified dragon at the front of the circle, her scales a deep silver marked with the scars of centuries, took a single step forward and then stopped herself. Her name was Sarath, and she had witnessed over 200 choosings in her long life. She had never once seen anything like this. Daniel, meanwhile, had no idea what was happening. He only knew that 12 small, warm, scaly creatures were now climbing over his legs, nuzzling against his torn jacket, and making soft chirping noises that sounded almost like purring. Pain and confusion mixed together as he tried to push himself upright, but the hatchlings clung to him stubbornly, refusing to let go. "Okay," he muttered under his breath, voice shaking. "Okay, this is not normal." The silence around the clearing stretched painfully long. None of the elders spoke. None of them moved to intervene. It was as if the entire species had forgotten how to react to a moment that broke every rule they had ever known. Somewhere in the back of the gathered crowd, a younger dragon whispered something that sounded like fear, quickly hushed by an older voice. Sarath finally moved, stepping closer with slow, deliberate care, her massive form casting a shadow over Daniel and the hatchlings piled around him. She lowered her head until her golden eyes were level with his, studying him the way one might study a puzzle with missing pieces. Daniel stared back, too exhausted and too injured to feel the full weight of fear he probably should have felt in that moment. "You are not supposed to be here," Sarath said, her voice deep and resonant, carrying easily across the clearing despite its quiet tone. It was the first time Daniel realized these creatures could speak, and the shock of that fact nearly overwhelmed the throbbing pain in his leg. "Neither was I planning on it," Daniel managed to say, glancing down at the hatchlings still clinging to him like he was the only solid thing in their entire world. "My ship crashed. I didn't mean to walk into whatever this is." Sarath said nothing for a long moment, her gaze shifting from Daniel to the hatchlings and back again. Something had happened here that no law, no tradition, no memory of her kind could explain. And as the storm clouds finally broke apart above them, revealing a sky full of unfamiliar stars, she understood one simple truth. Everything was about to change. The council chamber smelled of old stone and burning herbs, and it was here that Daniel Voss found himself the next morning, sitting on a low wooden bench that was clearly built for creatures far larger than him. His leg had been wrapped in some kind of thick, sweet-smelling paste that had already dulled the pain to a faint ache. He did not know who had treated his wounds. He only remembered waking up in a stone room, alone, with 12 hatchlings curled around him like a living blanket. They were curled around him now too, actually. Every attempt by Dralith handlers to remove the hatchlings for the morning feeding had ended the same way, with the younglings shrieking and thrashing until they were returned to Daniel's side. Even now, as he sat before the full council, 2 hatchlings were draped across his lap, and another 3 were tucked against his back, peeking out with wide golden eyes at the enormous dragons surrounding them. "This has never happened in the history of our people," said a dragon with dark green scales, his voice sharp and clipped. His name, Daniel would later learn, was Dravith, and he did not bother hiding his disgust as he looked down at the human. "A stranger stumbles into the most sacred right we possess, and somehow the younglings choose him over their own kind. It is unnatural. It is dangerous. It is what happened," Sarath replied calmly from her place at the head of the chamber. "Whether we like it or not." "Then it must be undone," Dravith snapped. "The bond can still be broken if we act quickly. Every day this continues, it grows stronger, and stronger bonds are harder to sever." Daniel shifted uncomfortably on the bench, feeling very much like a stray animal being discussed by people who did not think it could understand them. He cleared his throat, and to his surprise, every dragon in the chamber turned to look at him at once. "I didn't ask for this," he said, keeping his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I crashed here by accident. I don't know your customs, I don't know what a choosing is supposed to look like, and I definitely didn't try to steal anyone's babies." A ripple of low murmurs passed through the gathered elders. Sarath raised a claw, and the chamber fell silent again. "No," she agreed, studying Daniel with an expression he could not quite read. "I do not believe you intended this. But intention does not change what has occurred. The younglings have bonded to you. Severing that bond by force, before it has fully settled, could kill them." That single sentence changed the entire mood of the room. Dravith's expression flickered, and even the harshest of the assembled elders seemed to hesitate. Daniel felt a cold weight settle in his stomach as he looked down at the small creatures pressed against him, their scales still soft and their eyes still too big for their heads. He had crash-landed on an alien world less than a day ago, and now he was apparently responsible for the lives of 12 baby dragons. "So what happens now?" he asked quietly. Sarath considered the question for a long moment before answering. "For now, you will remain here, under guard, and you will care for the hatchlings as their bond demands. The council will study this matter further before deciding your fate." Her golden eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him want to look away, though he forced himself not to. "Do not mistake this for freedom, human. You are a guest whose welcome has not yet been earned." "Understood," Daniel said, though he understood very little about any of this. The meeting ended shortly after, and Daniel was led out of the chamber by 2 silent Dralith guards, both of them eyeing him with open suspicion. The hatchlings trailed behind him in an uneven little parade, tripping over their own feet, chirping constantly, refusing to fall more than a few steps behind. He was taken to a modest stone building near the edge of the settlement, clearly meant to be his quarters for as long as the council allowed him to stay. The moment the door closed behind him, the hatchlings swarmed him again, climbing over his legs, nudging his hands with their snouts, clearly hungry and clearly exhausted from a full day of chaos. Daniel sat down heavily on the floor, surrounded by 12 small dragons who apparently now considered him their entire world, and let out a long, tired breath. "All right," he muttered, mostly to himself. "None of you came with instructions, did you?" One of the hatchlings, slightly larger than the others with faint blue markings along its back, let out a soft chirp and pressed its head against his palm. Something about the gesture, small and trusting, cut through the exhaustion and fear that had been building in Daniel since the crash. He was stranded on an alien world, surrounded by creatures who did not want him here, responsible for a dozen lives he had never asked for. And yet, looking down at the small dragon nuzzling his hand, he felt something shift inside him that he did not have a name for yet. A young Dralith handler arrived shortly after with a basket of food, though he refused to step fully into the room, instead sliding it across the floor and retreating quickly. Daniel understood the message clearly enough. He was not welcome here. He was tolerated, watched, and feared, all at once. That night, as the 12 hatchlings settled into an exhausted pile around him, Daniel lay awake staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, listening to the strange sounds of an alien world outside his window. He thought about his ship, now a burned wreck on some distant hillside, and about the long, quiet years he had spent as a lone surveyor, drifting from world to world with no one waiting for him anywhere. He had never had anyone depend on him before. Not like this. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and rested a hand on the nearest hatchling's back, feeling its steady breathing beneath his palm. Whatever happened next, whatever the council decided, he understood one simple thing as clearly as he had ever understood anything in his life. He was not going anywhere. 3 weeks had passed since the crash, and Daniel Voss had developed a system, mostly through trial and error, occasional panic, and a stubborn refusal to give up. Raising 12 baby dragons, he had learned quickly, was nothing like anything he had ever done before, and there was no manual anywhere in the galaxy that could have prepared him for it. Mornings started early, usually with a small dragon chewing on his boot or another one trying to climb onto his chest while he was still half asleep. He had given up trying to stop them from crowding around him at night. It was easier to just accept that personal space no longer existed in his life. Each hatchling had grown noticeably since the choosing, some faster than others, and each one had developed a distinct personality that made it impossible to think of them as a single group anymore. The blue-marked one, the largest of the clutch, had become something of a self-appointed leader, always first to investigate new sounds, and always the last to back down from anything that frightened the others. A smaller one with darker scales preferred to stay close to Daniel at all times, panicking if he stepped even a few feet away. Another one had an endless appetite for climbing anything taller than itself, including Daniel, much to his frustration and occasional pain. He had started giving them simple names, not the formal titles the Dralith might have used, but plain, practical names that felt right to him. It made things easier, both for himself and for keeping track of which hatchling was currently trying to eat something it shouldn't. Corvain, an older Dralith elder assigned by the council to observe Daniel's care of the hatchlings, arrived each day at dawn and stayed until dusk, watching in near total silence from a respectful distance. He was tall even by Dralith standards, his scales a weathered bronze color, and his expression rarely shifted from a look of deep skepticism. Daniel had assumed, correctly, that Corvain had been sent expecting to find evidence of failure. "They should be flying by now," Corvain said one afternoon, watching as the largest hatchling flapped its wings furiously without lifting more than a few inches off the ground before tumbling over. Dralith younglings under proper guardianship begin controlled flight within the first month. "He's trying," Daniel said, crouching beside the frustrated hatchling and gently helping it back onto its feet. "Give him a minute. He'll figure it out." Corvain made a low sound that might have been disapproval, watching closely as Daniel knelt beside the young dragon, speaking to it in a calm, steady voice, not with commands, but with quiet encouragement. It struck Corvain as strange, almost improper. Dralath tradition demanded discipline, structure, repetition drilled into younglings from their earliest days. What Daniel offered instead looked, to Corvain's trained eye, dangerously close to indulgence. And yet, the hatchling tried again. And again. On the fifth attempt, its wings caught the air just right, and it lifted a full foot off the ground before wobbling back down. But this time it did not fall. It let out an excited chirp, spinning in a small circle, clearly proud of itself. Daniel laughed and scratched under its chin, and the hatchling pressed into his hand happily. Corvain said nothing, but he watched with an expression that had shifted from skepticism into something closer to careful consideration. Life continued this way for days, then weeks. Daniel improvised constantly, drawing on instincts he did not know he had, treating each hatchling not as a project to be trained, but as an individual with its own fears and its own small victories worth celebrating. When one of the smaller hatchlings refused to eat, Daniel simply sat with it for hours, talking quietly, until it finally accepted the food from his hand instead of being forced. When two of the hatchlings got into a fight over territory, Daniel separated them calmly and let each cool down before bringing them back together, rather than punishing either one. It was not the Dralath way. Corvain noted every deviation carefully in his reports to the council, and for the first several weeks, those reports carried a tone of quiet alarm. But something else began appearing in his notes as well, something Corvain had not expected to write. The hatchlings were thriving, not merely surviving, but thriving, growing stronger and more confident than any clutch he had observed in his considerable years serving the council. One evening, a fierce storm rolled across the settlement, lightning cracking across the sky and thunder shaking the walls of Daniel's small stone home. The hatchlings, still young enough to be frightened by loud noises, scattered in panic, crying out and searching desperately for safety. Daniel moved quickly, gathering them close, sitting against the wall with as many of them pressed against him as he could manage, speaking low and steady through the worst of the storm. Corvain, who had stayed later than usual that night to review notes, found himself standing in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. He should have left. There was nothing more to observe, nothing new to document. And yet he stayed, watching as the human calmed 12 frightened young dragons with nothing but his voice and his presence, asking for nothing in return. "You care for them," Corvain said quietly, more statement than question. Daniel looked up, surprised to see him still there. "Of course I do," he said simply, as if the answer should have been obvious. "They didn't ask to end up with me. Doesn't mean I get to treat them like they don't matter." Corvain did not respond immediately. He simply watched the human and the hatchlings for a long moment, something shifting behind his golden eyes that he did not yet have words for. Then, without another word, he turned and left into the storm, his thoughts far louder than the thunder rolling overhead. By the time the storm passed and the hatchlings finally drifted to sleep around him, Daniel had no idea that somewhere in the Dralath settlement, an old and stubborn elder was rewriting everything he thought he knew about what it meant to raise a dragon. Word of the failed choosing had spread far beyond the council chamber by the time the second month arrived, traveling from settlement to settlement across Dralath territory like smoke carried on wind. Some spoke of it in hushed, fearful tones, calling it an omen of decline, a sign that the old ways were crumbling. Others, mostly younger Dralath who had grown weary of rigid tradition, spoke of it with quiet curiosity, wondering if perhaps something had been wrong with the old ways all along. Serath had spent those 2 months buried in records few elders bothered to consult anymore, old archives detailing generations of hatchling mortality rates, growth patterns, and behavioral studies stretching back centuries. What she found disturbed her more than she wanted to admit. The numbers did not lie, and the numbers told a story the council had quietly ignored for far too long. Hatchling mortality under traditional guardianship had crept steadily upward over the last several generations, a slow decline masked by tradition and pride, never questioned because questioning it meant questioning everything the Dralath believed about themselves. She called for a private session of the council, away from the wider public eye, wanting the elders to face these numbers without the pressure of an audience. Dravith arrived already prepared for battle, his expression hard as stone before Serath had spoken a single word. "I know what you intend to say," he said, cutting through the formal greetings with characteristic impatience. You intend to use old numbers to justify allowing an outsider to raise our younglings. I will not accept it. I intend to present facts, Serath replied evenly, unrolling the ancient records across the stone table between them. Facts this council has avoided for longer than either of us have been alive. Our traditions are failing our younglings, Dravith. Slowly, quietly, but failing them nonetheless. And in less than 2 months, the human has raised 12 hatchlings stronger and more resilient than any clutch documented in the last 50 years. A murmur rippled through the gathered elders as Serath laid out the records in careful detail, comparing decades of data against the rapid, undeniable progress of the 12 hatchlings under Daniel's care. Even those inclined to dismiss her argument found themselves struggling against the weight of the evidence spread before them. It was Corvain who spoke next, surprising many in the chamber who remembered his early reports filled with suspicion and doubt. He rose slowly, choosing his words with obvious care. I was sent to find failure, he admitted. I expected to find failure. Instead, I have watched 12 younglings grow stronger, braver, and more capable than I believed possible in so short a time. The human does not follow our methods. He does not need to. What he offers them is something our traditions have forgotten how to provide. And what is that? Dravith demanded, his patience wearing thin. Corvain considered the question carefully before answering. Patience, he said simply. Trust. He does not command them into obedience. He earns it. I did not believe such a method could produce strong dragons. I was wrong. The chamber fell into uneasy silence. Dravith's claws scraped against the stone floor, his frustration evident in every line of his powerful frame. Even if what you say is true, he said finally, his voice low and dangerous, it changes nothing about the nature of what has occurred. A human should not hold such influence over our younglings. It is not natural. It is not right. And if we allow this to continue unchecked, what precedent do we set for the future of our species? Perhaps, Serath said quietly, the precedent we need. The debate stretched long into the evening, voices rising and falling as old alliances shifted and new arguments formed. Some elders sided firmly with Dravith, insisting that tradition existed for a reason and should not be discarded because of one unusual case. Others found themselves persuaded by Serath's records and Corvain's testimony, beginning to question assumptions they had never before dared to challenge. By the time the session ended, no final decision had been reached, but something fundamental had shifted within the council itself. The unquestioned authority of tradition had cracked, just slightly, and through that crack, doubt had begun to creep in. Dravith left the chamber that night more furious than Serath had seen him in decades, and she understood immediately that he would not accept defeat quietly. As she watched him storm away into the darkness, she felt the weight of what was coming settle heavily across her shoulders. She was right to worry. Within days, Dravith had rallied a faction of like-minded elders, all deeply unsettled by the growing sentiment toward change, all convinced that the bond between Daniel and the hatchlings represented a threat too dangerous to ignore. They began pushing for something far more drastic than continued debate, invoking an ancient and rarely used law that few in the council had considered in generations. The severance trial. It was a ritual older than most records could properly document, designed to forcibly break a bond between guardian and youngling when that bond was believed to be corrupted or unnatural. It was dangerous, painful, and had not been invoked in living memory, precisely because of the risks involved to the younglings themselves. Dravith argued it was necessary regardless of the risk, insisting that allowing an unnatural bond to strengthen further posed an even greater danger to the future of their species. Serath fought against the proposal with everything she had, but the fear stirred by decades of quiet uncertainty proved a powerful weapon in Dravith's hands. When the vote was finally called, it passed by the narrowest of margins, leaving Serath with no legal path left to stop what was coming. She found Daniel that evening, sitting outside his small stone home with the hatchlings sprawled around him under the setting sun, utterly unaware of the storm about to break over all their heads. Serath approached slowly, her expression heavy with something Daniel had not yet seen from her. "There is something you need to know," she said quietly, "and I fear you will not like it." The severance ground sat at the far edge of the settlement, a place Daniel had never visited before, surrounded by tall stone pillars carved with symbols worn smooth by centuries of weather. Sarath had explained the ritual to him the night before in careful, measured words, and Daniel had listened with a growing sense of dread that had not left him since. Now, standing at the edge of the circle with 12 hatchlings pressed close around his legs, he understood exactly why she had looked so grim delivering the news. Dravith stood at the center of the circle, flanked by 4 other elders who had voted in favor of the trial, all of them watching Daniel with expressions ranging from cold determination to open hostility. A crowd had gathered at the edges of the grounds, drawn by rumors of what was about to happen, murmuring quietly among themselves as the ritual preparations began. "This does not need to be difficult," Dravith said, his voice carrying easily across the circle. "Step back from the younglings, human. Allow the ritual to proceed peacefully, and no harm will come to you." Daniel looked down at the hatchlings surrounding him, each one pressed tightly against his legs, sensing the tension in the air even if they could not fully understand it. The blue-marked one, now noticeably larger and stronger than it had been weeks ago, positioned itself directly in front of Daniel, a low growl rumbling in its chest despite its young age. "And if I don't step back?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice as steady as he could manage. "Then the ritual will proceed regardless," Dravith said simply. "It will simply be more difficult for everyone involved." The ritual began without further warning. The 4 elders surrounding Dravith raised their heads in unison, beginning a low, resonant chant that seemed to vibrate through the very stones beneath Daniel's feet. The symbols carved into the pillars around the circle began to glow faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the chant, and Daniel felt a strange pressure building in the air, pressing against him from all directions. The hatchlings began to panic almost immediately. The smaller ones cried out, pressing harder against Daniel's legs, while the larger ones bared their teeth toward the chanting elders, torn between fear and the fierce instinct to protect what little family they had. Daniel dropped to his knees among them, wrapping his arms as far around as many of them as he could reach, speaking low and steady words of comfort even as the pressure in the air continued to build. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly, loud enough for the hatchlings to hear him clearly over the chanting. "I'm right here. I'm not leaving." The ritual intensified. The pulsing light from the pillars grew brighter, and the pressure in the air turned into something closer to physical pain, pressing down on Daniel like a great, invisible weight. He gritted his teeth, refusing to let go of the hatchlings clustered around him, even as the strain began to show clearly on his face. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of weakening under the pressure of the ritual, the hatchlings began to glow, faint traces of golden light rippling across their scales in perfect unison. It was a phenomenon none of the gathered elders had ever witnessed firsthand, something described only in the oldest and most obscure records of Dralith history. A synchronized surge, the old texts called it, a sign of a bond so genuine and so deeply rooted that no ritual could tear it apart without destroying the younglings themselves. The chanting faltered as the elders performing the ritual exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for what they were witnessing. Dravith's expression shifted from cold determination to something closer to alarm as the golden light around the hatchlings grew brighter, pulsing in time with their rapid, frightened breathing. "Stop the ritual!" Saratha's voice rang out sharply across the grounds, cutting through the chanting like a blade. She strode forward from the edge of the crowd, her expression fierce, leaving no room for argument. "This is no corrupted bond, Dravith. You are looking at proof, laid bare before this entire gathering, and you would risk the lives of 12 younglings rather than admit you were wrong." "The law demands the trial proceed," Dravith snapped back, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "The law demands we protect our younglings," Sarath countered, stepping fully into the circle now, positioning herself between the chanting elders and the small huddled group of hatchlings still glowing faintly around Daniel. "Continue this trial, and you risk killing them. Is that a price you are willing to pay for your pride?" Silence fell across the severance grounds, broken only by the frightened chirping of the hatchlings and the heavy breathing of the exhausted elders who had been performing the ritual. Dravith stood rigid, caught between his conviction and the undeniable evidence glowing brightly in front of the entire gathered crowd. Slowly, reluctantly, he raised a claw, signaling the end of the ritual. The chanting stopped immediately, the pulsing light from the pillars fading away, and the pressure that had been crushing down on Daniel finally lifted, leaving him gasping and exhausted on his knees, surrounded by 12 hatchlings whose glow was already beginning to fade back to normal. Serath approached slowly, kneeling to look Daniel directly in the eyes, her expression softer now than he had ever seen it. "You held," she said quietly, something like respect coloring her voice for the first time since they had met. "Even against everything this ritual demanded, you held." "They needed me too," Daniel said simply, still catching his breath, his arms still wrapped protectively around as many hatchlings as he could reach. Serath rose to her full height, turning to address the stunned crowd gathered at the edges of the grounds, her voice carrying clearly across the silence. "Let it be known," she declared, "that this bond has been tested by the oldest law our people possess, and it has proven true. Let no one question it again." Dravith said nothing, turning away in silence as the crowd began to murmur, disbelief slowly giving way to something closer to awe. Daniel remained kneeling on the cold stone ground, exhausted, aching, and surrounded by 12 small dragons who pressed close against him, safe for now, their trust in him proven beyond any doubt the Dralith Council could ever raise again. 6 months had passed since the crash, and the cliffs above the old settlement looked completely different to Daniel now than they had on that first stormy night. Back then, they had seemed alien and threatening, a harsh, unfamiliar landscape on a world he never intended to visit. Now, standing at the edge of the tallest cliff with the wind pulling at his jacket, they simply felt like home. The council had spent weeks in the aftermath of the severance trial working through what Serath called long overdue reforms, a phrase that had caused considerable grumbling among the older, more traditional elders. Dravith had not spoken publicly since the trial, retreating from council matters entirely, though rumors suggested he had quietly begun studying Daniel's methods from a distance, unwilling to admit it directly, but unable to deny what he had witnessed. Serath had taken the lead in reshaping how future hatchlings would be raised, blending old Dralith wisdom with the patient, trust-based approach Daniel had used almost by instinct. It was not an easy transition. Centuries of rigid tradition did not unravel overnight, and plenty of elders remained deeply skeptical of change. But the numbers spoke for themselves, and numbers, Serath had learned, were far harder to argue against than pride. The 12 hatchlings, no longer quite so small anymore, had grown at a pace that continued to astonish even the most experienced Dralith caretakers. Their scales had darkened and hardened, their wings had grown strong and sure, and each one had developed abilities and personalities distinct enough that comparing them to any standard clutch felt almost pointless. Corvain, who had once arrived each day expecting failure, now spent most of his time documenting their progress with something closer to quiet pride than scientific detachment. Daniel had changed too, in ways he was only beginning to understand himself. The solitary surveyor who once drifted from world to world with no one waiting for him anywhere had slowly, without quite realizing it, built an entire life here among a species that had never intended to accept him. He had learned their language properly now, understood their customs well enough to navigate them without stumbling, and found himself defending Dralith traditions to visiting humans from passing trade vessels with a fierceness that surprised even him. When his exploration guild finally traced his location and sent a recovery ship to retrieve him, assuming he would be eager to return to human space after being stranded so long, Daniel had turned down the offer without much hesitation. The guild representative, confused and slightly offended, had asked him directly why he would choose to stay on an alien world surrounded by creatures who had once debated whether to execute him. Daniel had simply pointed toward the cliffs, where 12 dragons were currently attempting, with mixed success, to practice formation flying under Corvain's patient supervision. "Because they're my family," he had said, as if the answer were the simplest thing in the world. "You don't walk away from family." Now, standing at the edge of the cliff with Serath beside him, Daniel watched as the 12 dragons circled overhead in the late afternoon light, their movements far more coordinated than they had been even a month ago. The blue-marked one led the formation with confident precision, no longer the wobbling hatchling who had once crashed clumsily into Daniel's lap during a terrifying storm. "They fly well," Serath observed, her voice carrying quiet satisfaction as she watched the formation bank smoothly against the golden sky. "They do," Daniel agreed, unable to keep the pride from his own voice. "Better than I ever thought they would, honestly." Sarath turned to look at him, studying his face for a long moment with an expression Daniel had come to recognize as her way of considering something carefully before speaking. "When you first arrived," she said slowly, "I believed you represented a mistake the choosing had somehow made, an error to be corrected as quickly as possible. I no longer believe that." "What do you believe now?" Daniel asked. "That perhaps our traditions had grown too rigid to recognize what our younglings truly needed," Sarath said. "That sometimes the old ways must bend, or even break entirely, to allow something stronger to grow in their place. You did not follow a single one of our methods, and yet you raised 12 of the finest younglings this council has witnessed in generations. That is not something I can simply dismiss as accident or luck." Daniel said nothing for a moment, watching the dragons continue their graceful circling above the cliffs, painted gold and orange by the setting sun. He thought back to that first terrifying night, injured and confused, surrounded by creatures he had never imagined could exist, with absolutely no idea what his life was about to become. He had not asked for any of this, and yet, looking at it now, he could not imagine his life any other way. "I think," he said finally, "that maybe it wasn't really about following methods at all. Maybe it was just about showing up every single day, even when it was hard, and never giving them a reason to doubt I'd be there." Sarath considered this for a long moment, then inclined her head slightly. Something Daniel had learned was her version of genuine respect. "A simple philosophy," she said, "and yet apparently a powerful one." Below them, the formation broke apart as the dragons began their descent toward the cliffs, diving and circling playfully now that their practice session had ended. The blue-marked one broke away from the others entirely, angling directly toward Daniel and Sarath, landing heavily but with growing grace on the rocky ledge beside them, immediately pressing its head against Daniel's side in greeting. Daniel laughed, scratching beneath its chin the way he had done since it was small enough to fit in his arms, though now it stood nearly as tall as he did. One by one, the rest of the dragons landed around them, tired and happy from their flight, settling into a loose circle around Daniel exactly as they had done every single day since the moment they first chose him. Sarath watched the scene with quiet contentment, understanding now what the entire council had once failed to see clearly. Tradition had its place, and centuries of Dralath wisdom still held real value. But sometimes, rarely and unexpectedly, something entirely new arrived to challenge everything a people believed about themselves, and the wisest choice was not to resist it, but to learn from it. As the sun sank fully below the horizon and the first stars began to appear across the darkening sky, Daniel sat among his family on the cliffs of a world he had never meant to visit, surrounded by creatures who had chosen him without hesitation and had never once looked back. Whatever challenges still waited ahead for him, for the hatchlings, and for the Dralath people as a whole, he understood now that he would face all of it exactly where he belonged. Right here, with them.